Hey guys, tonight we do something a little different. We're not asking whether you could survive a single day in a brutal historical period. Tonight, we're tracing the entire arc of one extraordinary, bewildering, almost impossible life. A life so dense with genius, contradiction, obsession and mystery that historians are still untangling it 500 years later. Tonight, we're talking about Leonardo da Vinci, the man who painted the most famous smile in human history, sketched flying machines 3 centuries before anyone actually flew, dissected human corpses in secret to understand the body, designed war machines, studied river currents, wrote backwards, stayed up until dawn, and somehow still found time to leave paintings unfinished for decades. Leonardo da Vinci was not just a painter. He was a scientist, an engineer, a musician, an anatomist, a cartographer, a botanist, a geologist, and a philosopher, all rolled into one infuriating, brilliant, distracted human being. And, yet, for all his genius, he was also deeply human. He was illegitimate. He was mocked. He was broke and then rich and then broke again. He had powerful patrons who frustrated him and rivals who undermined him. He loved deeply but quietly. He worked obsessively but left dozens of masterpieces unfinished. He was both the most celebrated artist of his time and at certain points a man who couldn't get a painting done on deadline. Sound familiar? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because the life of Leonardo da Vinci is not just art history. It is the story of what happens when one mind refuses to be contained by the world it was born into. Chapter 1. The Bastard of Vinci. The year is 1452. The place is a small hilltop town called Vinci, nestled in the rolling Tuscan countryside, about 20 miles west of Florence. It is a quiet place of olive trees, vineyards, and stone farmhouses. A place where the most exciting thing to happen in a given year is a good grape harvest or a well-attended village festival. And yet, on the 15th of April, something enters the world that will eventually shake it to its foundations. Leonardo is born illegitimate. That detail is not a footnote. It defines the first chapter of his entire life. His father is Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary of some standing. In 15th century Tuscany, notaries were respectable professionals who handled legal documents, contracts, and transactions for wealthy clients. Ser Piero is ambitious, well-connected, and going places. He is also not married to Leonardo's mother. Leonardo's mother is a woman named Caterina. She is a peasant girl, possibly an orphan, and there are even some modern scholars who have suggested she may have come from far outside Italy entirely. A recent claim proposed she might have been an enslaved woman from the eastern Mediterranean, based on fingerprint analysis of Leonardo's surviving works. That theory is contested, but it tells you something about how much mystery surrounds even the most basic facts of his origin. What we know for certain is that Caterina was not the kind of woman Ser Piero was going to marry. He had a career to think about. He had a reputation. So Ser Piero marries someone else, a woman of appropriate social standing named Albiera. And Caterina, not long after Leonardo's birth, is quietly married off to a local farmer. The child stays with the grandparents for a time, and then, when Leonardo is around 5 years old, he is brought into his father's house. Not because Ser Piero had a sudden pang of fatherly sentiment, though perhaps that played a role, but because Albiera cannot have children, and an illegitimate son is better than no son at all. This arrangement is strange by any era's standards, but 15th century Tuscany had its own logic about such things. Leonardo grows up in his father's household, acknowledged but not equal. He is Leonardo, the son of Ser Piero da Vinci. But he is also, always, the bastard, and that label has real consequences. In Renaissance Italy, illegitimate children were barred from certain professions. They could not practice law or notarize documents. They could not join the guilds of doctors or pharmacists. They could not, by the rules of his time, follow in his father's footsteps or pursue the most prestigious careers available to men of his intelligence. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who will become arguably the greatest mind of the Renaissance is, at birth, legally excluded from most respectable professions. Fate, apparently, has a sense of humour. But what that exclusion does, unintentionally, is push Leonardo toward the one category of work still open to him: the arts. Painters, sculptors, and craftsmen did not require the same kind of guild membership or legitimacy documentation. A talented boy could learn a trade from a master, develop his skill, and earn his living through his hands and his eyes. And young Leonardo's hands and eyes, it turns out, are extraordinary. He grows up in Vinci watching everything: the way water moves around a stone in the creek, the way light falls differently through an olive tree than through a solid wall, the way a bird adjusts its wings mid-flight to catch an updraft. He draws constantly on whatever surface he can find, filling the margins of household documents with sketches, horses, plants, shadows, faces, the complicated geometries of things most people glance at and forget. His uncle Francesco, who spends more time with young Leonardo than his busy father does, encourages this. Francesco is a farmer with a contemplative streak, happy to walk the countryside and simply look at things. He takes Leonardo into the fields and hills and teaches him to pay attention. That lesson, the discipline of patient, detailed observation, will become the foundation of everything Leonardo ever does. But growing up in his father's house has a shadow over it. Ser Piero eventually has legitimate children with later wives, and the family dynamics shift accordingly. Leonardo is never fully embraced, never quite at the centre. He is present, but peripheral. Loved in his own fashion, but never publicly claimed the way a legitimate son would be. This quiet rejection, this sense of being both insider and outsider, of being brilliant and yet somehow not enough, runs through Leonardo's entire life like a thread pulled just a little too tight. He learns to hold himself at a slight remove from the world, to observe rather than to declare, to be in rooms without quite belonging to them, to be present but always, in some essential way, alone. Those who study him say Leonardo almost never wrote in first person about his feelings. His notebooks, thousands of pages of them, are full of observations about the physical world, lists of things to investigate, sketches, plans, calculations, but almost nothing about his inner emotional life. He describes how water flows. He does not describe how loneliness feels, whether that's protective armour built in a childhood of not quite belonging, or simply the disposition of a man who preferred the external world to the internal one. We cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the boy from Vinci grows up watching everything, drawing everything, and slowly becoming something the world does not yet have a name for. Chapter 2. Florence, Verrocchio, and the workshop that changed everything. When Leonardo is around 14 years old, his father Ser Piero does something that will change the course of art history. He takes his son to Florence and secures him an apprenticeship in the workshop of Andrea del Verrocchio. Florence in the 1460s is the most exciting city in Italy, possibly in the world. The Medici family, that extraordinary dynasty of bankers turned art patrons, rules the city with a combination of political shrewdness and genuine cultural passion. Lorenzo de' Medici, who will eventually be known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, is growing into his power. He fills his court with artists, philosophers, poets, and scholars. He hosts debates about Plato. He commissions paintings and sculptures. He funds academies where men sit under olive trees and argue about the nature of beauty and truth. Florence is buzzing, crackling, electric with intellectual possibility. And at the centre of this artistic world, one of the most prestigious workshops belongs to Verrocchio. Andrea del Verrocchio is not a name most people know today outside of art history circles, but in 15th century Florence he is a titan. He is a sculptor, a painter, a goldsmith, and an engineer of remarkable skill. His workshop on the Via Ghibellina is part studio, part laboratory, part school. Young men come from across Tuscany and beyond to learn their trade there. They grind pigments, prepare wooden panels, stretch canvases, copy masters, and slowly, through years of patient work, develop their own abilities under Verrocchio's exacting eye. Leonardo arrives as a garzone, a workshop boy, probably around 14 or 15 years old. He is given tasks that are humble: mixing paints, preparing materials, running errands. This is how apprenticeships work. You earn your way into the more serious work through years of service and demonstrated skill. But something happens almost immediately that sets Leonardo apart from the other boys. Verrocchio notices. There is a famous story, likely embellished in the retelling, but probably rooted in something real, about a painting Verrocchio is working on called the Baptism of Christ. He assigns the young Leonardo to paint one of the angels in the background, a task typically given to apprentices as a way to speed up production. When Verrocchio sees what Leonardo has painted, he reportedly puts down his own brush and vows never to paint again because his student has surpassed him. Whether that exact scene happened that dramatically is questionable, but the Baptism of Christ survives, and when you look at it today, you can see the difference yourself. Most of the painting is competent, solid, and typical of the Florentine style of the era. Leonardo's angel glows with something different: the softness, the life, the sense that the light falling on that face is actually moving. Verrocchio is many things, but he is not a fool. He gives Leonardo more to do. In the workshop, Leonardo is exposed to everything: sculpture in bronze, goldsmithing, technical drawing, the geometry of perspective, that revolutionary tool Italian artists had been developing for decades to create the illusion of three-dimensional depth on a flat surface. He learns to mix oil and tempera, to work with different grounds and surfaces, to understand how light behaves differently on different textures. He is in his element. He is, perhaps for the first time in his life, in a place that can actually keep up with him. He also learns the practical side of being an artist in Renaissance Italy, which is not simply about genius and inspiration. It is about commissions, about pleasing patrons, about delivering work on time and to specification. These lessons, frankly, Leonardo absorbs more selectively than the technical ones. The workshop is also a social world. Other apprentices pass through. Sandro Botticelli, who will later paint the Birth of Venus, works in Florence at this time, possibly in Verrocchio's orbit. The young Pietro Perugino, who will go on to be a celebrated painter and eventually to teach Raphael, is probably in the workshop alongside Leonardo. These are talented men. But even among them, Leonardo begins to distinguish himself as something categorically different. He is fast. He is inventive. He does not just copy what he is told. He questions it. Why does this technique work this way? What happens if you do it differently? Can you capture moisture in the air with pigment? Can you make rock look like it breathes? Can you paint a shadow that feels like it is actually dark, rather than just a darker colour? He fills notebooks with questions, lists of things he wants to learn. things he wants to investigate. He wants to understand not just how to make things look real, but why they look the way they do. The optics of human vision, the way the eye perceives depth and distance, the way colour changes in haze. He is not satisfied being a craftsman. He wants to understand the machinery beneath the craft. He is also, by all accounts, beautiful. Contemporary descriptions of Leonardo are consistent on this point. He is tall, well-built, with long curly hair. He has a presence. He moves gracefully and speaks well. In a culture that admired physical beauty as evidence of inner virtue, Leonardo's appearance opens doors that his illegitimate birth might have closed. People are drawn to him. Patrons want to have him around. He also has qualities that are harder to see but equally important. He is extraordinarily charming when he wants to be. He can turn a conversation, disarm a skeptic, make the most demanding patron feel that their project is the most fascinating thing in the world. He knows how to be interesting. He knows how to... Hey guys, tonight we do something a little different. We're not asking whether you could survive a single day in a brutal historical period. Tonight, we're tracing the entire arc of one extraordinary, bewildering, almost impossible life. A life so dense with genius, contradiction, obsession and mystery that historians are still untangling it 500 years later. Tonight, we're talking about Leonardo da Vinci, the man who painted the most famous smile in human history, sketched flying machines 3 centuries before anyone actually flew, dissected human corpses in secret to understand the body, designed war machines, studied river currents, wrote backwards, stayed up until dawn, and somehow still found time to leave paintings unfinished for decades. Leonardo da Vinci was not just a painter. He was a scientist, an engineer, a musician, an anatomist, a cartographer, a botanist, a geologist, and a philosopher, all rolled into one infuriating, brilliant, distracted human being. And, yet, for all his genius, he was also deeply human. He was illegitimate. He was mocked. He was broke and then rich and then broke again. He had powerful patrons who frustrated him and rivals who undermined him. He loved deeply but quietly. He worked obsessively but left dozens of masterpieces unfinished. He was both the most celebrated artist of his time and at certain points a man who couldn't get a painting done on deadline. Sound familiar? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because the life of Leonardo da Vinci is not just art history. It is the story of what happens when one mind refuses to be contained by the world it was born into. Chapter 1. The Bastard of Vinci. The year is 1452. The place is a small hilltop town called Vinci, nestled in the rolling Tuscan countryside, about 20 miles west of Florence. It is a quiet place of olive trees, vineyards, and stone farmhouses. A place where the most exciting thing to happen in a given year is a good grape harvest or a well-attended village festival. And yet, on the 15th of April, something enters the world that will eventually shake it to its foundations. Leonardo is born illegitimate. That detail is not a footnote. It defines the first chapter of his entire life. His father is Ser Piero da Vinci, a notary of some standing. In 15th century Tuscany, notaries were respectable professionals who handled legal documents, contracts, and transactions for wealthy clients. Ser Piero is ambitious, well-connected, and going places. He is also not married to Leonardo's mother. Leonardo's mother is a woman named Caterina. She is a peasant girl, possibly an orphan, and there are even some modern scholars who have suggested she may have come from far outside Italy entirely. A recent claim proposed she might have been an enslaved woman from the eastern Mediterranean, based on fingerprint analysis of Leonardo's surviving works. That theory is contested, but it tells you something about how much mystery surrounds even the most basic facts of his origin. What we know for certain is that Caterina was not the kind of woman Ser Piero was going to marry. He had a career to think about. He had a reputation. So Ser Piero marries someone else, a woman of appropriate social standing named Albiera. And Caterina, not long after Leonardo's birth, is quietly married off to a local farmer. When the opportunity came to go to Milan and work for Ludovico Sforza, the powerful Duke of Milan known as Il Moro, Leonardo saw a fresh start, a new patron, a new city, a chance to reinvent himself on his own terms. He wrote Ludovico a letter that is still studied today as one of the great pieces of self-promotion in history. In it, Leonardo lists his qualifications. He describes himself primarily as a military engineer. He can design bridges. He can construct siege weapons. He can build portable cannons. He can design protected vehicles, predecessors of the tank. He knows how to drain water from trenches and undermine fortifications. He can construct ships for naval warfare. He is an expert in explosives and incendiary devices. And then, almost as an afterthought near the end of the letter, he mentions that he can also paint and sculpt, and that if Ludovico requires anything in those areas, he is equally capable of that. It is a masterpiece of knowing your audience. Ludovico was not looking for a painter. He was looking for someone who could help him build power, project strength, and defend his territory. Leonardo gave him that pitch, and it worked. He arrived in Milan around 1482, carrying with him his talent, his notebooks, his questions, and his unfinished adoration. He would not see Florence again for nearly 20 years. Chapter 4. Milan, the Duke, and the Last Supper. Milan under Ludovico Sforza is a different world from Florence. Florence is a city of merchants and intellectuals, a place where beauty is its own argument. Milan is more muscular, more political. Ludovico, called Il Moro for his dark complexion, is a patron of culture, but also a calculating ruler who sees art primarily as a tool of propaganda and prestige. If something makes him look powerful, magnificent, and in command of the greatest minds of the age, he wants it. Leonardo fits that bill perfectly. The 17 years Leonardo spends in Milan are the most productive of his life, and also among the most strange. He becomes, for Ludovico, a kind of all-purpose Renaissance genius on retainer. He is asked to design festivals and pageants. He designs elaborate sets, costumes, and mechanical special effects for court entertainments that apparently astonished everyone who witnessed them. He is an official ducal engineer, advising on canal systems and hydraulics. He sketches plans for a new ideal city after plague devastates parts of Milan. He works on architectural designs. He fills notebook after notebook with observations, experiments, and inventions. He also begins the project that will define his scientific life more than any painting. He begins dissecting human bodies. Anatomy in the late 15th century was not a recognized field of scientific study in the modern sense. Physicians relied on texts written by ancient Greek and Roman authorities, particularly Galen, whose descriptions of human anatomy were often wrong in ways that had been simply accepted for over 1,000 years. Dissection was occasionally permitted by the Church for the purposes of medical education, but it was tightly controlled, rarely done, and largely conducted by low-status assistants, while a professor read from Galen above them. Rarely anyone actually looked carefully at what was there. Leonardo changes this. He obtains permission to dissect corpses at hospitals in Milan, and later in Florence and Rome. He performs over 30 complete human dissections in his lifetime, possibly more. He does not look at what is there and confirm what Galen said. He looks at what is there and draws exactly what he sees. His anatomical drawings are so accurate that they were essentially rediscovered as scientific documents in the 19th century, and even today they stand as extraordinary achievements. He draws the heart, he draws the valves, he draws the chambers and the major vessels. He proposes a theory of how blood flows through the heart that is partly wrong in the details but startlingly close to correct in its basic intuition. Centuries before William Harvey formally described circulation in 1628. He draws muscles in layers, peeling back one to reveal the next, creating a system of visual analysis that modern medical illustration still uses. He draws the nervous system, the skull open to show the brain, the spine, the developing fetus inside the womb, curled in its miraculous position, looking exactly as a modern medical textbook would show it. He draws old men and young men, the differences between them, the way skin changes over a life, the way a face tells a story of time. And yet, none of this is published during his lifetime. His notebooks are not circulated. The discoveries he makes, the corrections he makes to century-old errors, the detailed maps of human structure that could have transformed medicine, sit in private pages that almost no one sees. It is one of the great what-ifs of scientific history. What would medicine look like if Leonardo's anatomical knowledge had been available to physicians in 1510 instead of being buried in notebooks until centuries after his death? But even as he fills those notebooks, Leonardo is still a painter, and in Milan he creates what many consider the single most important painting in Western art history. The Last Supper is not a small panel painting in a private collection. It is enormous, almost 30 feet wide and 15 feet tall, painted directly onto the wall of the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie, a Dominican convent in Milan. It depicts the moment described in the Gospel of John, when Christ tells his disciples that one of them will betray him. Every face around that table reacts differently, some with horror, some with disbelief, some with guilt, some with indignation. The room erupts in 12 different emotional responses, and Christ sits at the center of it all, still and calm in the storm. It sounds simple when you describe it that way, but what Leonardo has done is revolutionary. Previous painters who depicted the Last Supper put Judas on the opposite side of the table from the other disciples, physically separating the traitor. Leonardo puts all 12 disciples on the same side of the table as Christ, in a single dynamic row, and identifies Judas not by position but by expression and gesture. He is leaning back. He is clutching a bag, which we understand to be his payment for the betrayal. He looks caught. He looks already guilty. And yet he is right there among the others, hiding in plain sight. The psychological complexity of this composition is unlike anything painted before it. Leonardo had spent years studying faces, expressions, and the way emotion moves through the body. Every figure in the Last Supper is a study in that research. He reportedly wandered the streets of Milan with a notebook, sketching the faces of people he saw in markets, in churches, in taverns, looking for expressions that matched the emotions he needed to capture. He also makes a technical mistake that causes enormous problems. Rather than painting in traditional fresco, which is applied quickly in sections while the plaster is wet, Leonardo experiments with a different method, mixing oil and tempera on a dry plaster ground, which he applies to the wall. He does this because fresco requires working fast, and Leonardo refuses to work fast. He needs to be able to look at a section for a week, think about it, come back, adjust it. He needs time. The result, while he is painting it, is magnificent. But almost immediately afterward, the paint begins to deteriorate. The experimental method he chose simply doesn't hold up. Within 50 years of its completion, visitors to the refectory are already noting that the painting is peeling and fading. Over the subsequent centuries, it is damaged further by floods, by the installation of a door through the lower centre of the painting, and by a bomb that destroys the refectory roof during World War II, but miraculously leaves the wall with the painting standing. Today, after extensive restoration work, what you see in Santa Maria delle Grazie is partly Leonardo and partly the accumulated corrections and repairs of 5 centuries. But even through all of that, it still stops your breath. The Last Supper takes Leonardo approximately 3 years to complete, from about 1495 to 1498. During this same period, he is doing everything else. The notebooks, the anatomy, the engineering projects, the festival designs, the architectural plans, the studies of water and light, and the flight of birds. He also paints the Virgin of the Rocks, which exists in 2 versions because of a dispute with the patrons who commissioned it. He paints Lady with an Ermine, one of his most alive portraits, showing Cecilia Gallerani, Ludovico's mistress, holding a small white animal and turning as if responding to a sound just outside the frame. The aliveness in that turn, the sense of a frozen moment in a living person's day, is utterly unlike anything being painted at the time. And then, in 1499, everything comes apart. Ludovico Sforza, Leonardo's patron and employer for 17 years, is overthrown. The French king Louis XII invades northern Italy, and Ludovico flees. The French soldiers who occupy Milan reportedly use Leonardo's clay model of a giant horse monument as target practice, destroying it. The enormous bronze equestrian statue Leonardo had been planning for years, a monument that would have been the largest in the world, simply never happens. Years of work evaporated. Leonardo packs his notebooks and his paintings and leaves Milan. He is 47 years old. He is at the top of his profession and completely unmoored. Chapter 5. The Wandering Years. The years that follow are marked by movement. Leonardo goes to Venice briefly, then returns to Florence. He works for Cesare Borgia, the ruthless and brilliant military commander who is carving out a personal empire in central Italy with his father, Pope Alexander VI's blessing. Leonardo's job for Cesare is essentially military cartography and engineering. He travels through the Romagna, the territory Cesare is conquering, and makes extraordinarily detailed maps of towns, fortifications, and river systems. His map of Imola, created during this period, is so accurate and so beautifully rendered that it looks like it could have been made with satellite assistance. It was made with a man walking the streets and measuring with instruments he largely invented himself. Working for Cesare Borgia is an uncomfortable arrangement for someone with Leonardo's sensibilities. Cesare is not interested in beauty or inquiry. He is interested in conquest. He is ruthless, politically brilliant, and not at all troubled by the human cost of his ambitions. Leonardo sees armies on the march. He sees the aftermath of sieges. He designs machines that could kill people more efficiently. He draws weapons with the same careful precision he brings to a botanical study or an anatomical drawing. This is one of the great contradictions of Leonardo's life. He was a man who reportedly found violence physically distressing. He was a vegetarian, which was deeply unusual for his time, motivated by a reluctance to cause suffering to animals. And yet, he spent significant portions of his career designing instruments of war. He worked for warlords and military strategists. He drew crossbows with improved mechanisms and movable bridge designs that could help armies cross rivers quickly. He designed devices that could, in his own words, kill and wound at a distance. He wrote about this tension in his notebooks. He called the destruction wrought by war bestialissima pazzia, the most beastly madness. And then he went back to his drawings of cannons and siege engines. The contradiction never resolved. He was practical. He needed patrons. Patrons needed military engineers. And Leonardo could give them what they needed without perhaps fully confronting what that meant. He leaves Cesare's service before the end of 1502 and returns to Florence. He is now 50 years old. He begins competing for a major commission alongside Michelangelo, who is at this point 27 years old and already famous for his David, which has just been unveiled. The commission is for 2 enormous battle scenes in the great council hall of the Palazzo della Signoria. Leonardo is assigned the Battle of Anghiari. Michelangelo is given the Battle of Cassina. The 2 greatest artists in Italy, the elder and the young challenger, working in the same enormous room at the same time. The tension is documented. Michelangelo was dismissive of Leonardo publicly, mocking him for having failed to cast a bronze horse for Milan. Leonardo apparently did not respond directly, but he did not forget it either. The 2 men represented genuinely different visions of what art was supposed to do. Michelangelo believed in the absolute supremacy of the human figure, sculpted or painted with muscular clarity and divine power. Leonardo believed in something more mysterious, more fluid, more interested in the space between figures than the figures themselves. The Battle of Anghiari was another technically experimental disaster. Leonardo tried yet again to use an unusual painting method, this time influenced by descriptions of an ancient technique called encaustic, which used heated wax. When he applied heat to the lower part of the painting to dry it, the paint ran and was damaged. Once again, Leonardo's refusal to follow conventional methods cost him a finished work. The preparation drawings for the Battle of Anghiari survive in copies made by other artists who studied them, and they are astonishing. A knot of men and horses in the midst of violent struggle, grimacing with effort and ferocity. But the actual painting is lost. Another unfinished masterpiece. And yet, during these same years in Florence, Leonardo is working on something else. Something on a small wooden panel, a portrait of a woman. A merchant's wife, most likely, although the commission and the subject remain uncertain to this day. He calls her in his notes simply La Gioconda. We know her as the Mona Lisa. Chapter 6. The Smile That Conquered the World. She sits, she looks at you, and she does not tell you what she is thinking. That is the Mona Lisa's power, and Leonardo spent years, possibly as many as 4 years, trying to get it exactly right. He began the painting probably around 1503, when he was 51 years old. He did not finish it, or at least did not release it, for many years after that. He carried it with him. He kept working on it. He could not let it go. The subject is almost certainly Lisa Gherardini, the wife of a Florentine merchant named Francesco del Giocondo. The painting was probably commissioned to celebrate the birth of their second son or the purchase of their new home. These are ordinary reasons, domestic reasons, and the resulting object is one of the most extraordinary things a human hand has ever made. What Leonardo does in the Mona Lisa is different in kind from what other painters of his era are doing. He does not paint a flat surface. He does not use sharp outlines to define the forms. He paints in layers so thin they are nearly invisible, building up glazes of pigment over months and years until the image seems to glow from within. The edges of her face dissolve into shadow without a clear boundary. Her hands, which most scholars agree are painted with a mastery that surpasses even the face, suggest weight and warmth and the faint possibility of movement. The landscape behind her is mysterious, full of geological formations and waterways that seem to belong to no real place, a dreamscape assembled from Leonardo's notebooks. And the smile. It is famously ambiguous, famously ungraspable. Scientists have analysed it using imaging technology and determined that it changes depending on where exactly you focus your gaze. When you look at her eyes, the smile appears clearly. When you shift your focus directly to the mouth, the smile seems to become more neutral, harder to read. This is not an accident. Leonardo understood how human vision works, how the eye perceives differently at its center versus its periphery, and he used that knowledge deliberately to create a smile that behaves differently depending on how you look at it. It is a psychological illusion constructed from pure observational science. The most famous smile in the world is a trick, a beautiful, deliberate, masterfully constructed trick. He also paints the atmospheric haze of the background with a technique he develops and refines throughout his career called sfumato, from the Italian word for smoke. Sfumato involves blurring the transitions between areas of light and dark so that the edges of things seem to breathe rather than simply sitting on a surface. It gives his paintings a sense of depth and atmosphere that is unlike anything being done in Italian art at the time, and that will influence painting for the next 500 years. The Mona Lisa is not a record of a woman. It is a demonstration of everything Leonardo knows about human perception, about light, about the nature of what it means to see. He spent his career studying how the world looks because he was dissatisfied with how everyone else was depicting it. The Mona Lisa is the culmination of that study. He never sells it. He carries it with him for the rest of his life. It goes with him to Rome. It goes with him to France. When he dies, it passes to one of his students, who sells it to the French king. It stays in royal collections for over a century, then becomes the property of the French state after the Revolution, and eventually ends up in the Louvre, where it sits today behind glass in a room specifically built for it, drawing millions of visitors a year who stand before it, often disappointed by its modest size and the crowd around it, and then find themselves, against all expectation, unable to look away. The Mona Lisa is not famous because it is the best painting ever made. Experts will debate that question endlessly. It is famous because it is the most alive painting ever made, because it refuses to be a static object, because it watches you back. Chapter 7. The notebooks, the inventions, and the mind that wouldn't stop. If Leonardo had never painted a single picture, he would still be one of the most remarkable human beings who ever lived, because of what is in his notebooks. He filled between 5,000 and 7,000 pages of notebooks during his lifetime. About 7,000 pages survive. The rest are lost, which means we may have only a portion of what he produced. What we have covers virtually every branch of knowledge that existed in his era, and several that wouldn't formally exist for centuries. He wrote backwards, from right to left, in a mirror script that can only be read in a mirror or by trained readers. Whether this was to prevent people from stealing his ideas, as some have suggested, or simply because he was left-handed and found that writing this way prevented smearing the ink, or because he simply liked the way it looked, no one knows for certain. Probably some mixture of all three. In those pages, he designs a flying machine. He observes birds for years, studying how they use their wings to manipulate air currents, and he concludes that human flight is theoretically possible if one can replicate the mechanics accurately enough. He designs an ornithopter, a machine with flapping wings like a bird. He designs a screw-shaped aerial device that rotates to lift itself into the air, a concept that anticipates the helicopter by 4 centuries. He designs a glider. He calculates wing loading ratios. He is wrong about some of it. The ornithopter does not work. His materials and the available power sources of his era could never have made human flight possible, but his underlying principle, that air has physical, designs a tank. A covered wheeled vehicle designs a tank. a covered wheeled vehicle with armoured sides and mounted weapons, capable of moving across a battlefield while protected from arrows and projectiles. He notes that it must have its gears arranged correctly to avoid a design flaw that would make it drive in opposite directions from those intended. Some historians think this flaw was deliberate, that Leonardo, who hated war, quietly sabotaged his own design so it couldn't be built. Others think it was simply an error. We will never know. He designs a solar power concentrator, using mirrors to focus sunlight and heat water for the purpose of powering industrial processes. He designs a rudimentary calculator, a mechanical device for performing addition. He designs a water-powered cloth-shearing machine that would have industrialized part of the textile manufacturing process that employed thousands of Florentine workers by hand. He designs a self-propelled cart that operates on spring power, an early ancestor of the automobile. He designs ball bearings, hydraulic machines, pile drivers, a swing bridge, and a device for measuring wind speed that is a recognizable precursor to the modern anemometer. He studies geology and concludes that the world is vastly older than the biblical timeline suggests, because he finds marine fossils in mountains far from any sea and understands that they must have been deposited over enormous spans of time by ancient seas that once covered those heights. He studies rivers and understands the principles of erosion, sedimentation, and the way water carves the landscape over time. He studies botany and maps the arrangement of leaves on stems, discovering that they tend to spiral in patterns that ensure each leaf receives maximum light without being blocked by the one above. This principle, phyllotaxis, would not be formally described by science for another 2 centuries. He studies optics and understands that the eye functions like a camera obscura, that an inverted image forms on the retina, that light travels in straight lines and bends at the interface between materials of different densities. He designs optical instruments. He studies the way different colours affect each other when placed adjacent. He studies the physics of sound and how it travels through different media. He studies water obsessively. There are thousands of pages of water studies in his notebooks. Flowing water, turbulent water, water falling, water spiralling in a vortex, water curling around an obstacle. He draws these with the same obsessive precision he brings to everything, and he develops an intuitive understanding of fluid dynamics that is genuinely sophisticated for its era. He sees water as a key to understanding nature because it is never still, always moving, always transforming, always finding its own path through whatever landscape it encounters. He also writes things that are more difficult to categorize, fables, prophecies, written in riddles whose answers are everyday objects or events presented as if they are catastrophes. A prophecy that reads like the end of the world but whose answer is simply men shearing sheep. Short, sharp observations about human nature that read like proverbs. He is not only a scientist and artist, but a writer with a genuine literary sensibility, and a darkly comic one at that. He makes lists in his notebooks. Things to learn, things to investigate, who to ask about this or that subject, books he wants to read, mathematical problems he wants to solve. He sets himself an agenda that no human life could possibly complete, and then he pursues it with the energy of a man who genuinely cannot understand why he should stop. He is also deeply insecure about his education. He did not have a formal classical education. He could not read Latin or Greek with ease, which in his era meant that huge swaths of ancient philosophical and scientific literature were inaccessible to him without translation. He calls himself, more than once in his notebooks, an homo senza lettere, a man without letters, an unlettered man. He means this as a criticism of himself. He is aware that the scholars and philosophers of his day look down on artisans and engineers, as people who work with their hands rather than their minds. His response to this is characteristically Leonardo. If they dismiss experience and observation in favour of ancient texts, then so much the worse for them. Experience is the mother of all certainty. He writes this, or something like it, repeatedly. He trusts what he can see, test and measure more than what anyone, however ancient and respected, has written down. This empirical instinct, this preference for direct observation over received authority, is fundamentally modern in spirit. It is the basis of the scientific method that will not be formally described until Francis Bacon in the 17th century. Leonardo is practicing it in the late 15th. Chapter 8. Rome and the Shadow of Michelangelo. In 1513, Leonardo is 61 years old. A new pope has taken the throne in Rome. Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who once overlooked Leonardo in favour of other artists, has become Pope Leo X. He is a great patron, and Rome, under his papacy, is a city of astonishing artistic activity. Raphael is painting the Vatican rooms. Michelangelo has just finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling and is embarking on new projects. The greatest artists in the world are flowing toward Rome, drawn by papal commissions and the promise of glory. Leonardo goes too. He arrives with a small household, including his young assistant, Gian Giacomo Caprotti, known by the nickname Salai, a young man who has been with him for over 20 years. Salai arrived in Leonardo's household as a 10-year-old boy in 1490 and stayed for the rest of Leonardo's life in Italy. He was reportedly beautiful, mischievous, sticky-fingered, prone to lying, and entirely unruly. Leonardo's notes about him in the early years are full of irritated accounting of things Salai has stolen and money he has had to pay to replace them, and yet Leonardo kept him, funded his painting lessons, dressed him well, and maintained what appears to be a deep, if complicated, bond with him for decades. The exact nature of their relationship is another thing that can be inferred but not confirmed from the documentary record. In Rome, Leonardo receives the support of Giuliano de' Medici, the Pope's brother, who gives him studio space and a stipend. He works on optical experiments, mirror designs, and new mathematical investigations. He attempts to revive his anatomical work, but runs into trouble when a German mirror maker in his workshop complains to the Pope about the dissections, claiming they are improper and disturbing. The church authorities intervene and curtail his access to hospital corpses. His anatomical research, which he has been conducting for years, and which he dreams of organising into a comprehensive treatise, is disrupted again. Rome is also difficult because of Michelangelo. The younger man is now at the absolute peak of his powers and his fame. He is the dominant artistic figure in the city and, many would say, in the world, where Leonardo is diffuse, curious, spread across dozens of disciplines simultaneously. Michelangelo is concentrated, furious, focused entirely on the supreme expression of the human figure in stone and paint. They represent opposite poles of what a Renaissance genius can be. And Leonardo knows he is losing the race in at least one sense. His paintings are famous. His name is celebrated. But he has produced relatively few finished works compared to the great mass of his notebooks and drawings and plans. Raphael, who is 30 years younger than Leonardo and has learned extensively from studying everything Leonardo has done, is producing masterpiece after masterpiece at a pace that makes Leonardo's output look sparse. Michelangelo is finishing enormous projects that transform spaces. Leonardo is still carrying paintings he began years ago, still working on drawings that will never become anything more than drawings. He is also getting older, 61, 62, 63. In an era when men routinely died before 50, Leonardo's health is relatively good, but he begins to slow. His right hand is troubled by what appears to be a partial paralysis, possibly a stroke in the early 1510s. His primary painting hand is compromised, though he continues to draw and write with his left. Rome does not bring him the triumphant late-career flowering he might have hoped for. He is honoured, respected, even revered. But he is not at the centre of things. The centre belongs to others. And so when an offer comes from an unexpected direction, Leonardo, for the last time in his life, picks up and moves. Chapter 9. France and the King Who Loved Him. King Francis I of France is 20 years old in 1515. He has recently taken the French throne and is already showing himself to be a monarch of enormous energy, ambition, and, crucially for Leonardo, a genuine passion for Italian art and culture. He has invaded northern Italy in the continuing series of wars that have churned across the peninsula for decades, and in 1515 he meets Leonardo in Bologna, when the French king and the new Pope Leo X are both present for diplomatic negotiations. Francis is captivated by Leonardo. Here is the old master in person, the creator of the Last Supper, the painter of the Mona Lisa, the engineer and inventor whose reputation has preceded him for decades. Francis invites Leonardo to come to France. He offers him a house, a stipend, and a title, premier painter, engineer, and architect to the king. He offers him, essentially, a comfortable old age with no specific obligations, just the pleasure of his conversation and his presence. Leonardo accepts. He is 63 years old. He travels over the Alps, one of the most demanding journeys available to a man of his age and era. He brings with him his household, including his loyal assistant Francesco Melzi, a young nobleman who had joined Leonardo's circle in Milan, and who will become, in these final years, Leonardo's closest companion and eventually the primary custodian of his notebooks. He brings his paintings, including the Mona Lisa and 2 other works he has never released, and he goes to France to spend whatever time remains to him in comfort, in freedom, and in the company of a young king who genuinely loves him. The king installs Leonardo in a small manor house called Clos-Lucé, near the royal chateau at Amboise in the Loire Valley. A tunnel, according to local tradition, connects the 2 buildings, so that Francis can visit Leonardo informally without ceremony. Whether the tunnel actually existed as described is uncertain, but the relationship between the elderly Italian artist and the young French king was unquestionably warm and genuine. Francis reportedly said of Leonardo that no other man had known as much about painting, sculpture, and architecture, but also about philosophy and other things. He sat with Leonardo and talked for hours. He was not looking for paintings, though Leonardo likely continued to work on the Mona Lisa and other pieces during these years. He was looking for something harder to quantify, the experience of being in the presence of a mind like Leonardo's, of listening to a man describe what he had seen and thought and wondered about across a life of extraordinary inquiry. Leonardo continued to work in these final years, though his hand made painting increasingly difficult. He designed elaborate pageants and festivals for the French court. He worked on a project for a new canal system. He continued revising and organizing his notebooks, though the great treatises he had always planned, on painting, on anatomy, on water, on the flight of birds, on the nature of the eye, remained unfinished at his death, as so much of everything did. He also began to reflect. His notebooks from these years contain some of his most personal writing. He writes about wasted time, about the gap between what he intended to do and what he actually completed. He draws a series of apocalyptic visions, the deluge drawings, enormous storms and floods that seem to be sweeping away civilization, dark rolling clouds, trees bending to breaking, water overwhelming everything, whether these represent actual scientific studies of flood dynamics or emotional expressions of something darker approaching, or both, the images are extraordinary. They are unlike anything else in his work. They feel like a man watching something end. He also writes, somewhere in the notebooks, a famous lament. "Tell me if anything was ever done," he writes. "Tell me if anything was ever done." He means it as a reproach to himself. He had intended so much. He had started so much. The adoration of the Magi, unfinished. The Battle of Anghiari, unfinished. The great bronze horse for Milan, never cast. The treatises on anatomy, on water, on painting, none formally completed. The notebooks full of extraordinary knowledge, shared with almost no one. But he also means something more. He is asking whether the act of thinking, of seeing, of investigating has value even when it doesn't produce a finished object. Whether a life spent in furious inquiry into the nature of water and light and the human body, a life spent asking questions that often remained unanswered, counts as having accomplished something. Chapter 10. Death, Legacy, and the Question He Left Open. On the 2nd of May, 1519, in the small manor house of Clos-Lucé in the Loire Valley, Leonardo da Vinci dies. He is 67 years old, which is a good age for any man of the Renaissance, and a remarkable one for someone who spent his career essentially inventing new ways to think about everything. Giorgio Vasari, the Italian artist and writer who will later publish his famous Lives of the Artists and who is our primary source for many details of Leonardo's life, writes that King Francis I held Leonardo in his arms as he died. This is almost certainly not literally true, since records suggest Francis was elsewhere that day. But it tells you something about the legend that was already forming around Leonardo's death before his body was even cold. The story felt true enough to tell. It felt like the right ending for a man who had been so beloved by the king who gave him his last home. Leonardo's will is straightforward. He leaves money to his half-brothers, still the legitimate sons who had always been, legally, more fully his father's children than he was. He leaves his student Salai, who had gone back to Milan years before, a portion of his estate, including some paintings and a vineyard outside Milan that Ludovico Sforza had given him decades earlier. He leaves his books, his drawings and his instruments to Francesco Melzi, the young man who had been with him in France and who loved him, and who would spend the rest of his long life trying to organize and preserve the notebooks. Melzi does his best. He lives until 1570, 40 years after Leonardo, and keeps the notebooks safe. But after his death, his heirs are less careful. The notebooks are dispersed, sold, given away, scattered across Europe. For the next century and a half, they drift through private collections, many of them barely looked at, their significance not fully understood. Some are lost entirely. Others survive by chance, turning up in places no one expected. The Codex Atlanticus, the largest surviving collection of Leonardo's papers, eventually lands in Milan's Ambrosiana Library. The royal collection at Windsor Castle holds hundreds of his drawings. Other notebooks are in Paris, in Madrid, in Seattle, in various private hands. The world takes a long time to understand what it has inherited from Leonardo. He is famous immediately after his death, of course. His paintings are treasured. The Mona Lisa, which Melzi may have sold to King Francis, stays in French royal collections for a century. Artists study his techniques. His name becomes shorthand for a particular kind of Renaissance mastery. But the full extent of what was in those notebooks, the anatomy, the engineering, the scientific insights, the range of his inquiry, takes much longer to be appreciated. When serious scholars begin working through his notebooks systematically in the 19th century, what they find is staggering. Here is a man who independently arrived at insights that the scientific revolution of the 17th century would credit to others. Here is a man who designed machines that would not be built for 300 or 400 years. Here is a man who understood the mechanics of the human body with a precision that the medical profession did not achieve formally until centuries after his death. And here, too, is a man who left almost none of it in a form that could benefit anyone in his own time. The notebooks were private, the treatises were unfinished, the discoveries were made and then sealed away, taken on the road as he moved from city to city, patron to patron, kept close but shared with no one. Why? This is the question that haunts every serious engagement with Leonardo's life. Why did he not publish? Why did he not organize his findings and share them? Other men of his era understood the value of printed knowledge. The printing press was already transforming Europe when Leonardo was a young man. Gutenberg's Bible appeared in 1455, 3 years after Leonardo's birth. Printing shops were spreading. Knowledge that had previously been confined to handwritten manuscripts was being democratized at a pace the world had never seen. And yet Leonardo kept everything to himself. Every discovery, every invention, every observation, written backwards in a private hand in notebooks he never released. Some scholars argue that he intended to publish and simply never got around to it, that the same procrastination that left paintings unfinished left his treatises unwritten. Others argue that he was genuinely afraid of what might happen if his anatomical work in particular drew the wrong kind of attention from the church. Others suggest something more personal, that he was a man for whom the act of inquiry itself was the point, that finishing and publishing felt like closing a question rather than keeping it open, and keeping it open was the only state he was comfortable with. There may also be something about control. Leonardo's notebooks were his world, his private universe of questions and observations and inventions and images. Sharing them meant releasing them into a world that he fundamentally did not trust, a world that had labelled him a bastard at birth and a criminal at 24, a world that overlooked him for commissions that went to lesser artists, a world where patrons promised payment and then didn't deliver, where rivals spread rumours, where politics could destroy a life's work overnight as Ludovico's fall had destroyed his bronze horse. Keeping the notebooks close was keeping something entirely his own. Or perhaps the explanation is simpler and sadder. Perhaps Leonardo simply could not stop. He could not reach the end of a question because every answer opened 10 more questions, and stopping to write a treatise meant choosing to stand still in a universe that was always offering new things to look at and wonder about. The incompleteness was not a failure. It was the shape of his mind. Chapter 11. What he actually left behind. Let us be clear about what Leonardo da Vinci left to the world, because the accounting is more extraordinary than any summary can capture. He left approximately 17 paintings that are securely attributed to him. 17, for a career that spanned nearly 50 years. That is the entire surviving output of the most celebrated visual artist of the Renaissance. There are also a handful of works that may be his that scholars argue about, but the core, the confirmed work, is small. The Annunciation, the Baptism of Christ with Verrocchio, Ginevra de' Benci, the Virgin of the Rocks in 2 versions, Lady with an Ermine, La Belle Ferronnière, the Last Supper, the Virgin and Child with St. Anne, St. John the Baptist, the Mona Lisa. And yet, within that small number, are some of the most studied, most analysed, most copied, most loved objects ever made by human hands. He also left the notebooks, not as a published body of work, but as a private archive that took the world centuries to fully inventory and appreciate. Those notebooks contain, depending on how you count, somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 pages. They include the anatomical drawings, which are recognised today as among the great scientific illustrations ever made. They include the engineering designs, the flying machines, the armoured vehicle, the hydraulic systems, The optical instruments, they include the studies of water and geology and botany. They include thousands of drawings of the human figure and the natural world that are works of art in their own right, regardless of whether they ever became paintings or sculptures. And they include the lists, the plans, the self-reproaches, the fables, the prophecies, and the occasional late-night thought that reads like a man talking to himself at the end of a very long day. He also left students. Salai went back to Milan and became a competent, if not spectacular, painter. Francesco Melzi preserved the notebooks and taught others what Leonardo had taught him. Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio, another pupil from the Milan years, carried on aspects of Leonardo's style in northern Italy, and even artists who never met him, who simply looked at his paintings or heard descriptions of his methods, were changed by the encounter. The sfumato technique, the atmospheric perspective, the psychological depth of his portraiture spread through Italian and eventually European painting and changed what painters thought was possible. He left, in a broader sense, the idea of what a comprehensive human mind could do. The term Renaissance man, meaning a person who excels across multiple domains of knowledge and practice, exists because of Leonardo, or at least he is its ultimate embodiment. He is the proof of concept for a particular kind of intellectual ambition, the refusal to be confined, the insistence that biology and mathematics and art and engineering and music and philosophy are all aspects of a single inquiry into the nature of things. He also left, and this is perhaps the most personal of his legacies, the model of a certain kind of person. The person who sees everything, who notices, who cannot walk past a swirling eddy in a stream without stopping to understand it, who looks at a horse and immediately needs to draw it from 20 angles, who lies awake at night making lists of things to find out, who finds the world inexhaustibly interesting, and who is therefore, in a fundamental way, never bored and never done. There is a quality to Leonardo's attention, as revealed in his notebooks, that is almost painful in its intensity. He wants to understand everything, not in the casual sense of wondering about things, but in the deeply serious sense of needing to know how they actually work, needing to see through the surface to the structure underneath. He applies this attention equally to a flower and a war machine, and a human face and a river current and the human heart. Everything is equally worthy of his sustained, burning focus. That quality of attention, that model of what it looks like to take the world seriously as an object of study, is one of the things he gave us. The scientists and artists and engineers and writers who came after him did not all read his notebooks. Many of them had no direct access to what he had discovered. But his example, the fact that such a range of inquiry was possible for one person, that you did not have to choose between art and science, between beauty and rigour, between the sensory and the analytical, his example shaped what people thought a human mind could reach for. Chapter 12. The Man Behind the Myth. Leonardo da Vinci has become, in the centuries since his death, something of a myth. The universal genius, the original Renaissance man, the proto-scientist who saw the future, the greatest painter who ever lived. These are all in varying degrees true, but they are also, in the way of all myths, slightly flattening. They turn a complicated, contradictory, sometimes difficult human being into an icon, a symbol, something that stands for an idea, rather than a person who actually lived and breathed and struggled and failed. So let us try to see the person. He was a man who spent his entire life being, in some fundamental sense, homeless. Not literally. He had rooms and studios, and eventually a pleasant house in France. But in the deeper sense of belonging, he did not belong to Florence or Milan or Rome or France. He was always passing through. He did not belong to a family in the ordinary way, Having been removed from his mother, and always somewhat peripheral in his father's household, he did not belong to a profession in the ordinary way, being too many things at once. He did not belong to a category of person that his era had a name for, being what we would today call something like bisexual, in a time when that was not so much unacceptable as simply unspeakable. He managed this existential homelessness with charm, curiosity, and extraordinary discipline. He made himself necessary to powerful people. He made himself fascinating to everyone he met. He worked in the notebooks and the studio with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. He kept moving, and he kept inquiring, and he kept drawing, because those activities gave him a form of belonging that people and places could not. He was also capable of real friendship. Francesco Melzi, who loved him sincerely and grieved his death genuinely, is evidence of that. The bond with Salai, however complicated, lasted 30 years, which is not nothing. The warm correspondence we have glimpses of with certain patrons and collaborators suggests a man who, when he allowed it, could be deeply engaged and genuinely warm. He was funny. The fables and prophecies in his notebooks have a dry, dark wit. He played with language and loved puns. He was a skilled musician who could improvise verses as well as play. At court dinners, he was reportedly a brilliant conversationalist who could hold his own with the most educated scholars of his era despite his anxiety about his lack of formal training. He was also, let us be honest, maddening. He took on commissions and then abandoned them. He started projects of staggering ambition and then started something else before finishing the first. He made technical decisions that were visionary in conception and disastrous in execution, and then watched his experiments deteriorate while standing nearby. He possessed knowledge that could have advanced human understanding in multiple fields by generations, and kept it locked in notebooks that almost no one read. Was he aware of this? Certainly. His self-reproaches in the notebooks are real and recurring. Tell me if anything was ever done. That lament is not a false modesty, it is a genuine reckoning with a gap between what he intended and what he achieved that he felt keenly. The man who understood more about the human body than any physician of his era could not bring himself to write the book that might have transformed medicine. The man who designed flying machines 3 centuries before aviation could not build any of them. The man who could see further and more clearly than almost anyone alive kept his vision largely to himself. And yet, the paintings exist. The Mona Lisa exists. The Last Supper, damaged and restored and damaged again, still exists on that wall in Milan and still stops the breath. The anatomical drawings exist, and they are among the most beautiful things ever put on paper. The notebooks exist, tens of thousands of pages of one extraordinary mind in conversation with the universe. It is enough, more than enough. It is, by any reasonable measure, more than any person has a right to leave behind. Chapter 13. The Eternal Questions. When you spend time with Leonardo, when you read what has been written about him, and look carefully at what he made and left behind, you eventually arrive at a question that refuses to go away. What would he have done with the internet? It is a silly question in one sense, the kind of breathless anachronism that serious historians properly wave away. But it points to something real. Leonardo's fundamental problem, across his entire life, was the gap between the pace of his mind and the pace of the world he lived in. He thought faster than he could build. He understood things that the available technology of his era had no way to realize. He made discoveries that had no publication infrastructure to receive them, and no scientific community to evaluate and build upon them. He lived in a world that was simply too small for what he was trying to do. This is not a complaint. It is not even entirely a tragedy. Every person is born into a particular moment, and Leonardo's moment gave him things as well as withheld them. It gave him the patronage system of the Italian Renaissance, which, for all its frustrations, produced an environment of extraordinary artistic ambition and achievement. It gave him the freedom to roam across disciplines without being told to specialize. It gave him access to fresh corpses and powerful patrons and a new city every time he wore out his welcome in the old one. It gave him more than it denied him. But the question points to Leonardo's peculiar position in history. He is the great liminal figure, standing at the threshold between the medieval world and the modern one, looking with one eye backward at the classical traditions he was trained in, and with the other forward toward a scientific and technological future he could intuit but not live to see. He is the hinge, the pivot point, the man in whom two epochs meet. He is also a reminder of something important about how genius actually works. We tend to imagine genius as inevitably productive, as reliably converting insight into achievement, as moving in a straight line from vision to realization. Leonardo's life is the counterexample. It shows that the most extraordinary mind can be perpetually frustrated by the gap between what it can imagine and what it can achieve. It shows that prolific brilliance and radical incompleteness can coexist in the same person. It shows that the act of thinking, of seeing, of investigating has value even when it does not produce a finished product that the world can hold and name and put on a wall. Leonardo's notebooks are the evidence for this. They did not transform medicine or engineering in his lifetime. They did not launch a scientific revolution. They sat in a box and were scattered by neglect after his death. But they existed. He had thought those thoughts. He had seen those things. He had drawn those drawings. And eventually, centuries later, the world caught up to where he had been and found his footprints there. Chapter 14. The Science of Seeing. There is something worth pausing on, because it gets to the heart of what made Leonardo different from every other artist of his time, and arguably from most people who have ever lived. It is not that he was smarter, though he was extraordinarily intelligent. It is not simply that he was more talented, though his technical facility with paint and drawing was without peer. It is that he looked differently. Most people see the surface of things. They see a tree, or a face, or a wave crashing against a rock, and they register what it is and move on. Leonardo looked through the surface to the structure underneath. He saw a tree and immediately wanted to understand the geometry of how its branches divided and subdivided, why leaves arranged themselves in spirals, how water travelled up from the roots to the tips. He saw a face and immediately began analysing the way the muscles beneath the skin determined the shape of every expression. He saw a wave and started calculating the physics of water in motion, the relationship between velocity and the shape of a curl. This quality of attention is something you can see directly in his drawings. When he draws a hand, he doesn't draw the hand as it appears. He draws the hand as though he is looking through the skin to the tendons and bones beneath, and then he layers the surface appearance over that structural knowledge. The result is that his drawn hands look more real than hands drawn from direct observation, because they are built on a deeper understanding of what a hand actually is. He applied this same approach to water for most of his life. He watched rivers. He studied the patterns of turbulence behind a stone, the way a current fans out after passing through a narrow channel, the geometry of whirlpools and eddies. He filled pages with drawings of flowing water, trying to capture the movement of something that is by definition always changing. He compared it to the movement of hair, to the movement of wind through grass, to the patterns of flames. He was looking for underlying rules, a grammar of flow that governed all these different phenomena. Modern physicists and engineers recognize in these drawings an intuitive grasp of fluid dynamics that would not be formally described until centuries after Leonardo's death. He did not have the mathematics to express what he understood, but he understood it. He could see it. He did the same thing with geology. He found marine fossils in the mountains of northern Italy and understood immediately that this meant the mountains had once been below a sea. He calculated roughly the timescales involved. The Earth was old, much older than anyone wanted to say out loud, in an era when the Bible provided the official chronology of creation. Leonardo did not shout this conclusion from rooftops. He wrote it in his notebooks and moved on to the next observation. He was not interested in starting theological arguments. He was interested in understanding how things worked. He was also deeply interested in the mechanics of perception itself. He spent years thinking about how the human eye works, how light enters it, how the image forms, why we see depth and colour and shadow the way we do. He understood that what we call seeing is not a passive recording of reality, but an active construction performed by the brain. He understood that the eye does not see the same at its centre and its periphery, that colours change in strong light versus dim, that shadows are never simply dark versions of their surroundings, but have their own complex colour relationships. All of this went into his paintings. Every technical choice he made in paint was informed by this deep understanding of how vision actually works. When he blurs the edge of a shadow, it is not a stylistic preference. It is the correct representation of how the eye actually perceives that edge. When he makes distant objects slightly bluer and hazier, it is not convention or atmosphere for its own sake. It is the accurate depiction of how light scatters in the air between the viewer and a faraway object, a phenomenon that physics would not formally describe until much later. He was painting with physics before physics had a name. Chapter 15. The Body as Machine. Of all the obsessions in Leonardo's remarkable life, the one that perhaps most purely expresses his combination of scientific ambition and artistic sensitivity is his relationship with the human body. He came to anatomy the way he came to everything, through wanting to paint it correctly. If you are going to paint a figure in motion, it helps to know not just what the surface looks like, but what the muscles underneath are doing. If you are going to paint an expression, it helps to understand which specific muscles around the mouth and eyes produce which specific configurations of feeling. Anatomy, for Leonardo, started as a practical question. It became a consuming lifelong passion. He dissected his first human body, probably in the 1480s, in Milan, with the cooperation of the hospital authorities there. The bodies he worked on were typically those of executed criminals or unclaimed hospital patients, people at the margins of society who had no family to object, no status to protect them from this particular posthumous indignity. Leonardo worked quickly, because in an era without refrigeration, a body deteriorated fast. He worked by candlelight, often through the night, drawing with one hand what the other hand uncovered. He was not squeamish, or at least he learned not to be. He wrote in his notebooks that you must have a stomach for it, and that working alone through the night with deteriorating bodies was not for the faint-hearted. He acknowledged the difficulty, and then he went back the next night and kept drawing. What he produced over approximately 3 decades of intermittent anatomical work was a body of illustration that is simply without precedent. He drew the skeleton. He drew the muscles in multiple layers, stripping them away one by one to show what lies beneath each. He drew the nerves and the vessels. He drew the internal organs in cross-section, from angles that allowed a viewer to understand their 3-dimensional shape from a 2-dimensional drawing. He invented the technique of showing an object from multiple viewpoints simultaneously, which is still used in modern technical illustration. He was particularly fascinated by the heart. He dissected it, studied its chambers, and watched it work in living animals whose chests he opened. He built glass models of the aortic valve and pumped water through them to understand how the valves opened and closed. He concluded that the heart's action was fundamentally mechanical, a pump, not the seat of the soul as philosophy and religious tradition insisted. He described the turbulence of blood flow in the aorta with an accuracy that modern cardiovascular surgery has confirmed using modern imaging technology. He was also fascinated by the way the body ages. He dissected both old people and young people, comparing the density of their vessels and the texture of their muscles, trying to understand the mechanism of aging itself. He did some of his most moving drawings from the body of a very old man who had died in the hospital in Florence, and who Leonardo described as having reported no illness, but simply a gradual failing, a gentle extinguishing. The old man's face in Leonardo's drawings is peaceful. The drawings of his open chest are a scientific document of what happens to the body over a very long life. Together, they are among the most profound works Leonardo ever made. None of this reached the medical community in his lifetime. It sat in the notebooks. When his anatomical drawings were finally published centuries after his death, the reaction among scientists was astonishment. He had been there first. He had seen it and drawn it and understood it. And then he had kept it to himself, not out of malice or selfishness, but because he never quite finished organizing it into a form ready for the world. Chapter 16. The music, the myth, and the man nobody knew. There is a version of Leonardo da Vinci that floats above history, untouchable, made of pure intellect and flawless genius, a kind of secular saint of human achievement. This is the Leonardo of gift shop posters and motivational quote compilations. And while it is true that his achievements were extraordinary by any measure, this burnished image flattens something essential. It hides the person behind the monument. Leonardo was also a musician. This is often mentioned as a footnote in biographies, wedged between the anatomical drawings and the flying machines, as if it were a charming minor hobby rather than a serious dimension of his life. But music mattered to him in ways that are revealing. He played the lyre, specifically a silver lyre he is said to have made himself in the shape of a horse's skull, a characteristically Leonardo piece of engineering that doubled as an instrument. He had a fine singing voice. He could improvise songs and accompany himself in a style that contemporaries described as uniquely beautiful. He was sent to Milan initially, partly as a musician. When Ser Piero arranged for him to present himself to Ludovico Sforza, the gift he carried was that silver lyre. Music was the calling card. Painting was the afterthought. That tells you something about how Leonardo was perceived by those who knew him most intimately. He was not primarily to the people who actually spent time with him, the solitary genius labouring alone in a studio. He was vivid company. He was someone you wanted at a dinner party, someone who could make any room more interesting simply by being in it. He was competitive, though he generally managed to disguise it with grace. His notebooks occasionally let the mask slip. There are pointed observations about the differences between painters and sculptors, clearly aimed at Michelangelo's camp, that are too specific to be purely theoretical. He was aware of his rivals, and they were aware of him, and the awareness was not always comfortable on either side. He and Michelangelo occupied the same artistic world for decades, and the tension between them was the tension between two radically different ideas of what art was supposed to accomplish. Called prophecies, riddles phrased as called prophecies, riddles phrased as apocalyptic predictions whose answers turn out to be mundane. Here is one he wrote. Great masses of men will be seen moving swiftly from one country to another. This sounds like the end of the world. The answer is flies. He found these jokes endlessly amusing, and they appear scattered throughout the notebooks with no particular warning or organization. Between the anatomical observations and the engineering plans, a little plague of jokes about everyday objects disguised as divine catastrophe. He was also generous with students, despite his complicated feelings about completion and legacy. Salai he funded and tolerated for 30 years in a relationship that probably contained more genuine affection than his exasperated accounting notes suggest. Melzi he treated with real warmth, teaching him everything he knew about painting techniques and leaving him the notebooks as the ultimate expression of trust. Others who passed through his orbit, Boltraffio, Marco Doggiono, Cesare da Sesto, all absorbed something essential from contact with him and carried it forward in their own work. What none of them could fully absorb was the totality of what he was. They could learn his technique, they could imitate his style, they could practice the sfumato and try to replicate the atmospheric depth of his backgrounds, but they could not replicate whatever it was inside him that made him unable to look at a spiraling eddy of water without immediately needing to understand the mathematics of its movement, or unable to pass a flowering plant without recording the arrangement of its petals with scientific exactitude. That quality was not teachable, it was simply his. He also ate differently from almost everyone around him. In an era of meat-heavy feasting, particularly in the households of the wealthy and powerful where he spent most of his adult life, Leonardo was vegetarian. This is attested to by multiple sources and is consistent with what we know of his character, specifically his discomfort with the causing of suffering to other living things. He reportedly bought caged birds in the marketplace just to open the cages and release them. He described the killing of animals in his notebooks with language that reveals genuine distress. And yet, he designed weapons and worked for warlords and drew the aftermath of battles with a steady hand. The contradictions were never resolved. They were simply lived with. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Leonardo. Not as a monument, but as a person. He did not resolve his contradictions. He carried them. He was capable of beauty and complicit in violence. He was generous and withholding. He was gregarious and deeply private. He was obsessively productive and legendarily unable to finish anything. He was the most curious person who ever lived, and he kept most of what he found to himself. Conclusion: tell me if anything was ever done. Let's bring this home, because after everything we've walked through, after the bastard boy of Vinci, and the apprentice in Verrocchio's workshop, and the master who painted the Last Supper, and the scientist who mapped the human body, and the designer of flying machines, and the old man in France carrying a painting he couldn't stop working on, what are we supposed to do with Leonardo da Vinci? We are supposed to be humbled, and then we are supposed to be energized. Humbled because the scale of what one person managed to see and think and make in a single human life is almost impossible to process. He was not superhuman. He ate and slept and had bad days and got frustrated with patrons and lost things and made mistakes and left work unfinished, and sometimes, we suspect, was deeply lonely in ways he never wrote about. He was thoroughly human, and he still somehow managed to be Leonardo da Vinci, energized because his life suggests that the world is always richer than the categories we use to describe it. He refused to be confined to painting, to engineering, to science, to any single lane. And in refusing confinement, he saw more than anyone around him was looking at. He trusted his eyes. He trusted experience over authority. He believed that the natural world was knowable, and that the act of looking carefully, really carefully, with complete attention and genuine curiosity, was the most important thing a person could do. He also never finished, and that, perhaps, is the most human thing about him. The grandest, most comprehensive intellect the Renaissance produced. A man who could see centuries into the future, could not manage to do his taxes or deliver a painting on time or write the books he kept meaning to write. He was endlessly distracted by the next interesting thing. He was chronically optimistic about the time available and chronically wrong about how much of it had already passed. He left the world the Mona Lisa. He left the world the Last Supper. He left the world 7,000 pages of the most remarkable thinking ever committed to paper. And he left the world with a question, the question he asked himself in the notebooks that echoes across 5 centuries and lands, somehow in our ears. Consider what it actually means to carry something unfinished. We live in a culture that worships completion. Finished is the goal. Shipped is what counts. Done is better than perfect, is a mantra people tattoo on their arms. And there is wisdom in that. There is real wisdom in finishing things, in releasing work into the world, in trusting that imperfect and complete is more useful than perfect and withheld. But Leonardo offers a counter-argument, not by claiming his way was right, but simply by existing. He shows us that the work of looking is never really done, that a mind fully committed to understanding the world will always find more to investigate, more to question, more to draw. That incompleteness, when it comes from genuine, inexhaustible curiosity rather than fear or laziness, is its own kind of integrity. He could not finish the adoration of the Magi because he kept finding more to say. He could not release the anatomical treatise because he kept discovering more to add. He could not put down the Mona Lisa because the smile kept revealing new things when the light changed. He was, at his core, a man who could not accept that the world had yielded everything it had to offer. He always suspected there was one more layer underneath, one more current beneath the surface of the water, one more muscle beneath the skin, one more question the answer to which would open onto 10 more questions. That quality is what makes his legacy so strange and so durable. He did not give us finished answers. He gave us a model for how to ask. And in a world where the questions keep changing and the easy answers keep proving insufficient, that model may be more valuable than any completed treatise could ever be. He was a man who understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone before or since, that the gap between what we can imagine and what we can achieve is not a source of shame. It is the engine of everything. It is what keeps us moving. It is what keeps us looking. The boy from Vinci looked at the world and could not look away. And 500 years later, looking at what he left behind, neither can we. Tell me if anything was ever done. Here is the answer, Leonardo. Yes. What you did, the seeing and the drawing and the questioning, and the extraordinary insistence on looking at the world directly and clearly and without flinching, that was done. All of it was done, and it matters more now, 500 years later, than it did when you were alive. The boy from Vinci, the bastard, the unlettered man who wrote backwards and dissected corpses in secret and spent 4 years perfecting a smile and carried his paintings across the Alps in a cart, he is the reason we still know that attention is its own kind of genius, that curiosity is never wasted, that the world rewards eventually and in its own time the person who refuses to look away. He looked, he drew, he wondered, he never stopped. And 500 years after the last breath left his body in that small French house on a May morning in 1519, we are still catching up. So if you take one thing from the life of Leonardo da Vinci, let it be this. The questions are worth asking, even when the answers are a long time coming. The world is always more interesting than it appears at first glance, and the act of paying attention, really paying attention with everything you have, is never, ever wasted. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this journey through Leonardo's life moved you, surprised you, or made you think about things differently, please like the video and subscribe for more. Leave a comment and tell me what part of Leonardo's story hit you the hardest. The notebooks, the unfinished masterpieces, the boy from Vinci who was told in so many ways that he didn't belong and who responded by becoming one of the most unforgettable human beings who ever lived. Sleep well tonight, and maybe before you close your eyes, take a moment to notice something. Really notice it. The way light falls, the way a shadow moves, the way the world arranges itself when you decide to pay attention. Leonardo would approve. Night after night, across 5 centuries, the light from his paintings and the questions in his notebooks reach forward through time, not as relics, not as museum pieces behind glass, but as an invitation to do the same thing he could never stop doing, to look, to wonder, to fill the page, and never quite be done.